Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining our session today. My name is INNOVATE and I am the Chief of the International Hub on Behavioral Insights to Counter Terrorism, which was established as the Program Office of OCT in Doha, Qatar in January 2021. As an international hub on behavioral insights, we perform three core functions. We conduct and advance behavioral research to better understand the factors that are contributing to violent extremism and terrorism. We provide capacity building assistance to member states, regional organizations, and civil society partners to develop and implement programs, projects, and initiatives that integrate behavioral insights to counter terrorism. And we promote advocacy, outreach, and partnerships to share knowledge, experience, lessons learned, and good practices and expertise on integration of behavioral insights into counterterrorism interventions. Following our successful collaboration with DPPA during Behavioral Science Week 2021, we have teamed up again. This year, we will expand upon biases and barriers impacting upon decision-making and subsequent behaviors. More often, these biases and barriers are concerned with the beneficiaries of the subsequent interventions. However, policymakers and program designers are also subject to biases and experiencing barriers. When these are left unchecked, interventions may not have impact or can even backfire. So we're going to talk about this today, and I hope we all collectively will learn from our distinguished experts and enjoy what we must share. Our event will last for 1 hour and will contain 2 presentations of 15 minutes each, followed by a 15 minutes Q&A session. So we encourage everyone to think about questions, and I would like to remind all participants to use the hand function of the system if you would like to speak and voice out your question, or use the chat for any questions or clarifications that you may need. Now I would like to invite my co-host, Dr. Martin Welish, who leads the Innovation Cell in the Policy and Mediation Division of the UN DPPA. Dr. Welish, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, INNOVATE. It's unusual to be called Dr. Welish, but it's interesting. And we have a lot of scientific work actually today ahead of us. So this kind of builds a bridge to our conversation about behavioral science. But let me start by welcoming everybody warmly from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs side. In the Innovation Cell, which was around 3 years ago founded, we test out new approaches and practices, including new technologies, but also many non-tech related techniques like foresight and behavior science. And as INNOVATE mentioned, we have teamed, or one could even say ganged up again with OCT for the 2nd year. It has been indeed an exciting journey together to learn about behavioral science and new discoveries. Now, for the context of peace and security, behavioral science is not really new, but it is definitely a new, fascinating, multidisciplinary field that is constantly expanding, and we are constantly learning from new experiments and results and trying to apply them to our context in the field of the United Nations when it comes to bringing armed conflict to an end, or preventing conflict, or making sure that there's no relapse. So with that said, we have been trying to carry out a range of pilot projects in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, looking at intergroup dynamics, but also with an eye on measuring the efficacy of political messages. And Josh Martin from Beyond Company is going to say a few more words about this in a bit. We also have an eye on capacity building. In that very spirit, as mentioned in the invitation, we are happy to launch the first behavioral science learning game in the context of peace and security, which is called Speed Victory. I'm going to post the link in a bit. Which allows basically players to explore aspects of behavioral science, including norm nudging, countering political manipulation techniques, and disinformation campaigns. And this is pretty much based on a fictitious scenario, and it exposes you as players to behavioral tactics and techniques. And we're very excited to have this being launched during the UN Behavioral Science Week this year. Now, it is a true pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker today, And this is Josh Martin, who's the Executive Director of Beyond Conflict. He has been advising us in the DPPA Innovation Cell for a while. We have worked closely with him. Josh previously has been responsible for overseeing behavioral science-based innovation programs with Ideas 42. He has studied at Harvard and NYU. It would take a while to mention all his achievements, and it's much more interesting to listen to his experience. So I'm handing over to you, Josh. Thanks so much for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you, INNOVATE, for very generous and very informative introduction. So I'm sharing my screen. Can someone give me a signal that you see it correctly? Okay, great. Thank you, Martin. You're always there when we need you. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to kick off by just giving a little bit of a perhaps an overview of where we are at in terms of nudging for nonviolence. And I use those terms intentionally. I know that there may be many disagreements about what we mean, in fact, by nudging. There may even be disagreements about what we mean by nonviolence, and I think we're all okay with that. But the idea here is to promote an alternative way of using the methods that Martin began to describe on behavioral science for peace and security goals. And I'm, happy to, and in fact excited at the opportunity to engage with all of the heterogeneity of opinions and experiences that will exist around this topic. I want to just begin by presenting a little bit about a program that I happen to know about, which is a fantastic program started in Chicago called Becoming a Man. And this is a program working with youth, started on the south side of Chicago. These are primarily African-American youth. And they do a really interesting game. They do many different activities. It's a large program, and there's lots of interesting research done about it. But one of the games that they do, I think, is particularly illustrative for our purposes today. One of the things that they do is that they pair participants into pairs, and then they give one of the members of the pair a ball. And they ask the other one to try to get the ball from the first one who has the ball, and they give them 30 seconds to do that. And almost without fail, there's some amount of physical wrestling then ensues, and one tries to effectively take the ball away from the other one. And then when they're done, the facilitator says, "What happened?" And they said, "Well, you told me to take the ball away, so I took it away." And the facilitator says, "Well, why didn't you simply just ask for the ball?" And the one who was supposed to take it usually says, "Well, because I thought that, if I just asked for it, he would think I was a punk and I'd have to take it from him anyway, and we'd fight." And then the facilitator then asks the one who had the ball and says, "Well, what would have happened had he asked for the ball?" And generally they say something like, "I would have just given it to him. It's just a ball." So I use this point just to illustrate how profoundly unnecessary most violence really is, and not just in this particular context, but also in context, for instance, of civil unrest or even authoritarianism. Often we think about violence as sometimes the only way to resist an unjust or oppressive regime, and I don't want to in any way suggest that that is not true in many cases. However, there is interesting research on the way in which resistance campaigns can take a nonviolent form and actually be more effective than violent resistance campaigns. And again, that's not to in any way say that that's always the case, but on average, with historical data, we have the ability to tease out some of the differences involved between nonviolent and violent resistance campaigns and the effectiveness thereof. And I think it's worth reflecting on why sometimes violence is the first response, whereas it should be, in effect, the last resort. Why is that the case? What is it about our psyche, about our brains, about our decision-making and action-taking architecture that leads us sometimes to violence when we should choose a different path? And ultimately, of course, as with anything in behavioral science or applied psychology more broadly, we are brought back to this picture, which is, of course, the 3-pound machine that we all have between our ears. what purpose does that machine serve? Well, over generations, over millennia, it has evolved to serve essentially one function, which is to keep us alive. How does it do that? It solves problems. Now, the problems that our brain had to solve back when we were all hunter-gatherers are very different from the problems that our brain has to solve today. For instance, when engaging with different types of speech on social media. But if a tiger jumps out of the woods at you, then you have to respond super quickly, and your body needs to go from a fairly passive posture to a very active one that's ready to defend itself or flee at any within the space of a moment if you're going to stand any chance of survival. But today, if you see a post on social media that you don't like, the threat response that your body creates is going to be profoundly unnecessary and perhaps damaging, and certainly it's not going to lead you, for the most part, to a place of better understanding or better learning. And so what can we do as behavioral scientists to better understand how that works and what we can do about it? Well, first of all, there is this discipline, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of, and I like to use these books as examples of what I call behavioral science, which is the science of human decision-making and action-taking. Of course, these are books that are based on science, based on primary research, but are really designed for a general audience. If you're not aware of them, I would really encourage anyone to read them. I think they're very insightful on many different policy issues, and some of them even go as far as dealing with violence. Of course, violence is a little bit of a frontier issue still for the field, but that is, after all, why we're having this conversation today. And then there's also a literature that goes a little deeper into human psychology and human physiology and how it's related to influences that people accumulate during their lifetime. In particular, exposure to trauma, in particular, even going as far as human pathology, for instance, dispositional factors that may affect our things that we carry with us as we go through the world that may come into play and impact our decision-making or our action-taking when we come across things that may trigger us in particular ways. And so these literatures, if you combine them together, you get a certain amount of heterogeneity in the scientific literature that can be really useful for looking at conflict issues. And this is where I just plug the organization quickly that I work for, called Beyond Conflict. These are the tools that we apply in many different places around the world on issues of democracy and social identity, on issues of peace building and making dialogue programs, for instance, more impactful, more effective, more rigorous, and then also on applying trauma to prevent cyclical violence. And the theme that runs through our work, and I would argue all the work in this space, is that it's not about what we think. In other words, it's not about explicit ideology or what people say they believe. It's much more important how we think, what goes on beneath the surface. And one example I like to use for that is that conflict literally changes our brains in the sense that conflict stimuli are processed often in different parts of our brain than stimuli that are not directly related to conflict. And you can see this in the question of sacred values, which are things that you might value that are not processed in the same way, for instance, as concessions that you might make in a negotiation, for instance, over business. You might be quibbling with somebody over price. You might be there may be a question of someone having cheated someone else or something like that. We all negotiate on a regular basis, but when it comes to concessions that we make that are sacred to us, you can actually see where those things are processed in a very different part of the brain. And those things, of course, are things that are almost impossible for us to make compromises on. And so conflict, has this sort of specific effect on the type of decisions that we face and the responses that we're prepared to give. And the claim that I would make, and this is a paper that some colleagues of mine and other colleagues at the United States Institute for Peace recently wrote, traces the differences between the dispositional factors that lead individuals to nonviolent resistance and violent action in response to perceived oppression. And it may surprise you, it may not, that these factors are very similar to each other. Discontent, personal deprivation, etc. Really the same cauldron of factors that propel people towards taking action are present, whether it's violent action we're talking about or non-violent action. Now, what do we do with that? That can be very destabilizing in a sense, because in a sense, the claim is that it is not about the ideology itself, but that it's about these underlying factors that we have to have some strategy to deal with. And if we deal with ideology, it may simply be too late. And here's another way, I think, of making that case, which is that if we want to think behaviorally about violent action, you can actually trace back the steps that lead to violent action, and those are the ones in red over on the right of the screen. And this is from a study that was done by Jutta Clausen at Brandeis University several years ago that I really like, where they did qualitative interviews with former violent extremists who are incarcerated, and they traced, and these are extremists in the West for the most part, but you see patterns like this really anywhere. They traced the behavioral steps that they took on the way to committing violence. And if you look over on the left, what you see are actions that you would have a really hard time directly linking to violence if you were just looking at that side of the graph, right? So if you just see, these things in blue, things like seeking information, things like trying to find authority figures, things like dropping out of school, etc. These are things that there's no way you would think that that is something which is automatically going to lead to violence, right? And of course, many people do that and then are not violent. And yet these things tend to be very predictive in people that then ultimately do acquire some sort of explicit ideology. These things can be very predictive of people that ultimately taking violent action. So what's interesting about these behaviors is that they are, you might think of those as channel factors in a behavioral sense, in the sense that they once you do those things, they can lead you towards taking violence, and yet they are tractable. They are things that we actually can solve, right? We can stop someone from seeking out particular types of information, or we can try to change the authority figures that somebody encounters, or the lifestyle changes that somebody makes, etc. So these are, in a sense, this could be part of what explains how the same dispositional factors may lead to very different types of behavior. Here's another way to think about this, which is, when you talk to someone who studied applied psychology, there's always going to be this difference between, or really it's a continuum between factors that are fixed, in other words, attributable to an individual or a person, and those that are more contextually determined or more variable. So for instance, things that are personal or fixed are things like family history. I talked about trauma before, pathology, etc. And then things that are more contextual are things that have to do, let's say, with timing, or with the frequency in which an action needs to occur, or perhaps what you see your peers around you doing, or the way the physical environment may be laid out. It could be frequently a question of what information is salient. Is it something more about the costs of taking an action, or something more about the benefits of taking an action? So this is one dimension along which you might think of cognitive processes working. And somewhere in between, you have things like emotions and beliefs and attitudes, etc. Obviously, this is highly stylized, and I would never, attempt to claim, fully scientific basis for a simplified diagram like this. What's interesting is that we now have some guidance notes that have come out really in the last year from our colleagues over at UNDP who have developed these two guidance notes really to treat each end of the spectrum. So you have one that just came out on integrating mental health and psychosocial support into peace building, and then another one on applying behavioral science for preventing violent extremism. And so you have some initial attempts to begin to try to analyze this phenomenon of preventable violence according to these two dimensions, because of course they require very different solutions. So I want to just go through these three different sort of case studies to show how different types of solutions may work along the spectrum. So number one would be preventing trauma-driven cyclical violence. Another one would be countering hate speech, and again, that's somewhere in the middle with the beliefs and the attitudes. And then you have promoting nonviolent opportunities. So that's more the initial channel factors that may, even once someone has acquired personal or fixed attributes, perhaps even attitudes and beliefs, the things that may then be the sort of final step towards taking violent action. There's still things that you can do to try to prevent that from happening. So let's start with number one, preventing trauma-driven cyclical violence. This is a program that Beyond Conflict has piloted now in 3 different countries in the Middle East and in Latin America. It's a initiative of that my colleague Michael Nikinchuk, if you know his work, has really spearheaded together with other colleagues and our chief psychologist Vivian Khadari. And it involves several different components. It's a package intervention. It's about bringing relatable stories of refugees who have gone through trauma and communicating those stories in a sort of snackable, bite-sized type of way where they can be related to others who are like them. It's about providing psychoeducation, which is teaching people about how their brains work as a means of empowering them to better understand their own physiology and then take action when they recognize certain physical manifestations of their trauma reappearing. Then there are things like digital support, and this is, even getting into the slightly behavioral piece where you're reminding people of the content that they would have learned about. And then there are exercises to reinforce and counter the physiological manifestations of trauma, things like movement, breathing, and mindfulness exercises that come into the picture, that we have facilitators who walk people through and help people build into their daily practice. And we have gotten some attention on the subject and have been able to do a randomized control trial and are in the process of rolling out another one in which we see promising effects of on a number of different indicators. So things like, emotion regulation, for instance, is one of the promising outcomes where, being part of this program for a certain period of time leads you to be able to regulate your emotions in a more direct way, which we think is, a highly relevant trigger for ultimately taking violent action. Secondly, the hate speech example. So this is a project we did in Nigeria. Here are a couple of examples of social media hate speech that you might see that is, in which people are essentially promoting false or misleading narratives about outgroups. And this is, of course, not an isolated example. It's not one that is unique to Nigeria, but we happen to have some academic and practitioner partners we were working with in Nigeria on this subject. And we designed a radio and then ultimately a TV program that involves characters that are designed to counter what we saw as dehumanization, threat perception, and negative stereotypes. And these are all the actions and the characteristics of these characters were taken directly from the research on the subject. They were characters from mixed backgrounds themselves, and the idea being to cause people to reflect on what it would be like for them to incorporate someone from a mixed background like these characters into their families in the same way that they saw the TV characters doing it. And now I'm very happy to report this is reaching 84 million people on a regular basis. It's a very widely spread media intervention. And we've done now 2 different randomized controlled trials, and the latest results are that you see dehumanization go down quite significantly. Now, this is admittedly relatively recent after the exposure, so we don't know how these effects last in time. That's one of the unsolved questions, I think, for behavioral science overall, not just for this particular niche. But you see important reductions in dehumanization, threat perception, and negative stereotypes. But I would caveat this by saying that these interventions are great, but we don't yet know if this is enough to reduce violence at a communal level. We don't yet know if this is enough to really have a tipping point which will prevent the next outbreak of violence. And of course, if you're looking at interventions to prevent extremism specifically, it's probably not a cost-effective way to deliver those, even though this is a very cost-effective intervention for each individual. Nevertheless, it's not very highly targeted towards the people who most need these types of messages. So this is really more of a hammer type approach than a nail, if you will. And so finally, a third example, again, over on the behavioral end of the spectrum, over on the sort of opportunistic end of the spectrum, contextual end of the spectrum, is a program that Ideas 42 has done. And as Martin said, I used to work at Ideas 42 and know this program quite well. We were helping at-risk youth in South Africa to avoid violent situations that they may have put themselves in on a regular basis after work. And we designed an application. It was very rather rudimentary. It was intended to be exposed to people in a lab, and the kids came in and they were basically offered different sort of fun activities that they could do instead of what they might otherwise have done simply without thinking about it, which is just hang out with their friends on the street corner. And so it gave them these other ideas. Now some of these ideas are almost a little too wholesome in a sense, and you might not think that they're really fun. But what we found was that, and this is only just one of them, there were many other ones that they could see, and they had to choose. It forced them to choose, do you want to do that or do you not? Or you have a better idea or something else. And the exposure to this result, we did a randomized trial for this in a lab, and it turned out that people were about 56% less likely to participate in unsafe activities. Now, that's a self-reported measure. There are reasons to think that it may not be quite as high as that, but I think you get a promising indication that even when you have dispositional factors in place, even when there are, in some cases, deeply entrenched habits involved, you still have an opportunity to try to reduce violent behavior, at least among a population like this one. So why does all this matter? Well, let's take the pathway of your average violent person, and I'm not, at least I don't think I'm very violent, but nevertheless I'll use myself as an example. At some point from the pathway from being a regular person to doing something violent, you often will acquire something of an explicit ideology, right? You join a group that has a particular ideology, or you begin describing yourself or identifying yourself as someone with an ideology. And you might think of that, what happens afterward, as the active phase. And this is, again, from Jutta Clausen's research on violent extremism, this could be something like a year, or perhaps even less, where the ideology really becomes entrenched and your actions are somewhat hidden and therefore difficult to observe. And you're so highly motivated that it's really hard to reverse these actions. Once you're at this stage, there's not many options, right? Either you're trying to aggressively retrain somebody or something like that, or you are sending in the police or the army or something like that. And that's not going to be a great way to proceed if you can avoid it. So it's really this phase, the initial phase, the exploration phase, if you will, that can take a lot longer, in which the dispositional factors that I talked about are more treatable. There are programs you can do, like the one I presented, to try to prevent the trauma from even getting to the ideological stage at this stage. And actions are slightly more observable, and therefore they're also preventable. You can deter someone or sort of turn them away from the path that they were on using one of the behavioral techniques I also mentioned. So what matters is that initial phase is much more cost effective if we're thinking from a policy standpoint than the second one. So these techniques are, why even think about behavioral science for peace and security? Well, because if you're able to get people at this early stage, then there's probably a lot of down the road violence that you can prevent. Martin mentioned the program that we at Beyond Conflict have done in partnership with the DPPA Innovation Cell. So this was a project in the Middle Eastern country in which we rolled out a bunch of messages that were designed to help youth participate in a nonviolent way around the elections that were held during the past year. This was supported by a political mission, and we built a whole bunch of different scientifically based principles into these messages. For instance, social norms, the idea that people like you are doing something that you might have considered doing, so promoting a positive descriptive norm around a particular behavior. Myth busting, so helping to remove some of the, let's say, the natural cynicism that people might have built up around electoral processes by asking them to respond to certain questions that even go too far towards their natural aims, and therefore help people clarify their thinking a little bit around what they really believe. And then identity affirmations to try to get them to regard themselves in a slightly higher light, so that they believe they're capable of participating in a way that they might not have believed that they were capable of doing. And then plus some plan making. Plan making is always helpful as a way to support action once people have an intention of doing so. And I think what's interesting about this program, we don't yet have results, I should say, but what's interesting about this program in a sense is that you have the potential to really scale it. And at a meta level, it's really about taking the UN's default approach to public messaging and making it intentional, really grounding it in scientific insights, which is something that the Secretariat is actually well placed to do through the reservoir of expertise that it has built up. And I think Martin and the Innovation Cell is a good example of this. And missions can be, in a sense, the clients here, because each mission has a public relations arm. Each mission is sending out messages on a regular basis through many different channels, through the communications people there. And so why not take the opportunity to design those messages more intentionally and with more scientific grounding? So I'll just leave you with a final thought, which is that intentional design is really what this is all about. There's not any one scientific insight, there's not any one technique that I would have mentioned that I would recommend everybody use in every one of the countries that you work in or anything like that. Ultimately, it is about finding the right insight to solve the right issue. And so this is an example where the designers did not do that, I would argue, and this is in Beirut, a city that I've spent significant time in, and Martin has as well, where clearly the plan here was to try to inspire people effectively to not throw their trash on the sidewalk, and that did not happen. It also resulted in graffiti. Clearly, something about the beauty of the environment did not resonate with the passersby. This is another example from some time I spent in West Africa, where the idea was to be bold and upfront with everybody about a problem, namely corruption, that the country was, that the government was well known for. And the thought was, we're going to be bold, we're going to tell everybody that this is a problem, and everyone, again, is going to be sort of inspired to cooperate to solve it. Well, it turns out, if you know something about the way social norms work, that if you tell people that we are all at fault, rather than sort of sit up in their chair and take notice, they begin to realize that it's everywhere around us, and that makes it permissible, and perhaps they even become more likely to engage in corrupt behavior as a result. So again, another example of not really designing with intention. And finally, a more perhaps relevant example for conflict is this is a card that was handed out by the US Army in Iraq for counterinsurgency purposes. And I think you can tell, really, without even reading this, you can just look at this and imagine to yourself how much effort was put into the wording, into the design, etc. And really, the answer is not very much. And if, with only a little bit more effort, with only a little bit more intentionality, they probably could have made something much more effective. Whether or not you think, this particular goal is one worth pursuing, there's a certain amount of intentionality that should be part, really, of every design process. So I will leave you with that and turn it back over to our other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Martin, for this very comprehensive and I would say thought-provoking presentation. I see that it has already prompted a few questions in the chat, so please take your time to look at the questions. And let us continue. I have a pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Sofia Moskalenko, our next speaker. Dr. Moskalenko is a social and clinical psychologist and a lead researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. Dr. Moskalenko holds PhD in social and clinical psychology with over 2 decades specialization in radicalization, and she's an author of 5 books and dozens of articles on the radicalization, which includes the latest book called Pastels and Pedophiles: Inside the Mind of QAnon. Dr. Sofia previously conducted research for the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of State, and Department of Energy, and has presented her research in government at government briefings, academic conferences, television, radio, and news programs. Currently, Dr. Moskalenko is a BI Hubs consultant, and she will present 2 terrorism-specific behavioral insights, make a presentation on 2 terrorism-specific behavioral insights. Before I hand over to Dr. Moskalenko, please, all participants, if you could have your smartphones at the ready mode, because Dr. Moskalenko will be conducting 2 polls, which the audience can access through a QR code. Dr. Moskalenko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atayeva. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this exciting event, and it's a challenge to follow up after such an intense and indeed thought-provoking presentation. I will do my best. I will start by just generally overseeing what we can do to help the field as far as behavioral science is concerned. So the topic of our meeting today is how behavioral science can advance peace and security. And so let me just give you an idea of what is exactly behavioral insights approach that we're at the Hub trying to integrate into the field. Behavioral insights approach means relying on behavioral science research, which can include psychology, criminology, sociology, rather than relying on assumptions, intuitions, or on prevailing wisdom. What does this mean in the context of counterterrorism? So our field, countering and preventing violent extremism, is rather young. It really started growing in earnest after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And so the early ideas and theories we had about radicalization, about how people become terrorists, have been built on assumptions and intuitions, because we had very little data to test them. But since then, it's been over 20 years. We have now thousands of survey studies, experiments, case studies, and interviews that have been carried out to test these early assumptions and to suggest new, possibly more fruitful directions. The behavioral insights that were achieved through these research efforts are perfectly situated to inform CVE and PVE practitioners who are tasked with identifying communities vulnerable to radicalization and with delivering to them programming to prevent it. So to put it very simply, behavioral insights approach can help maximize effectiveness of the institutions and programs that are tasked with CVE and PVE. Let's go a little more specific. Let me demonstrate on a concrete example what this might mean to use behavioral science approach in CVE. In the next slide, I'm going to show you 3 vignettes, each describing an individual within a particular radical movement. In this case, alt-right or far-right, sometimes also referred to as neo-Nazi movement.
Sophia, I don't think we're seeing slides. Perhaps I speak only for myself, but I just want to
I'm sorry.
In case you weren't sharing them.
Thank you. Let me do that. Yes. Thank you, Martin. Okay. So this information is limited to what we might know about these 3 individuals based on their online behavior. I will then ask you to make a choice based on this limited information as to which of these 3 individuals presents the greatest terrorist threat and should therefore be the highest priority for intervention, either through surveillance or by law enforcement action or by targeted CVE programming. You will vote in real time, and I will show you the results of this public opinion poll. Then I will give you the answer that's based on behavioral insights findings. So I hope you can see it now on your screens. We have 3 individuals, John, Paul, and Peter. John frequents radical right forums where he's been posting hateful comments and memes, justifying violence against minorities and misogyny. And recently his posts have become more frequent and they feature more hateful content. Okay, Paul is frequenting the same online forums. And recently he has expanded the number of forums he's engaging in, but not the overall frequency of posting. So he is diversifying his forum experience. And finally, we have Peter, who is also a user of these alt-right forums, but he's a lurker. So he doesn't really post or interact with others. And then recently his activity on the forums has dropped in frequency, and he seems to have left some of the forums that he used to frequent. So 3 individuals. Look over these vignettes, make a choice in your mind before I switch the screen. John, Paul, Peter. Okay, and I'm going to switch the screen and you will see a QR code that you can scan with your mobile device. Or if you're watching this on your phone, then there is a link that I dropped in the chat that will take you to the same voting place. So here is a QR code, and I will give you a little time to make your votes. So I'm gonna count down from 5, and after that, I'm gonna close the voting and share with you the results. Okay, so you have few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, okay. So I am going to share now the results of the vote. Can you see the?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so 53% chose John, the guy who who started posting more frequently and more vitriolic content. 25 chose Paul, the guy who started to diversify his forum portfolio, and 22% of participants in this meeting chose Peter. So what does behavioral science say? I'm going to share my screen with you. And the answer is that the biggest danger as far as terrorist threat is actually Peter, the guy who's a lurker, doesn't post much, and has recently stopped posting in some of the forums that he used to frequent. So we know this from studies that looked at violent offenders from alt-right persuasion, and they traced back their online behavior from before these people committed their crimes. And they found that the people who were violent, as opposed to everybody else in that radical community, were actually less likely to post. And in the run-up to their violent action, they frequently withdrew from participation in these online activities of their alt-right community. So let's compare the vote with the actual fact. About over 70%, something like 77% of participants chose somebody who is not the greatest danger. Only about 20% of us here today made the right choice based on their intuition, common sense, and so on. So how is it that the choice that feels right is so wrong, to quote a lot of soft rock songs, right? How is it that if it's wrong, why does it feel so right to point the finger at somebody who is doing all this ideological talking as somebody who is going to do ideological acting as a result? And behavioral insights has an answer to this too. And that has to do with the way and the weight that we humans give to explanations of behaviors as compared to the behaviors themselves. We have this built-in bias toward ideology as opposed to other factors that include, for example, emotions, or that include things like means and opportunity, or things like the social environment and the situation around the person at the time. When we're trying to assess threats and predict prevention efforts, we tend to fall for stories that people tell about themselves. We tend to believe them when they say they want to do something and they will do something. And in the absence of plentiful data, early theories of radicalization have all focused on ideology. So you're not alone, you're in good company, as a necessary step in one's transition to terrorism. But luckily, we now have empirical data as to how necessary it actually is. So in this next and last interactive feature of this presentation, I will ask you to give your opinion by voting once again. You can use the same link that you used before, but I will also present a QR code on the next screen. And I will ask you to consider a radical community or a movement. Within any such community, there are individuals who are especially strong supporters of the most radical version of that ideology. So for example, in the context of jihadi ideology, we consider the following question a measure of this support of radicalization of opinion. Here's a question. Do you agree that bombing of civilians, including women and children, is justified in defense of Islam? So when we present this question in polls, we give people a 7-point scale to answer that ranges from 1, which is disagree completely, to 7, which is agree completely. And we find with whatever radical community we're looking at, with jihadis in particular, that a small minority will answer 7, endorsing fully this very radical opinion. The question I pose to you to vote on is this: what percentage of those who share this most radical jihadist ideology will proceed to act on their beliefs? What percentage of those with the most extreme version of an ideology ever engage in radical action? That's the question. And here are the options for voting: 50% or more, between 50 and 30%, between 30 and 10%, between 10 and 1%, or fewer than 1%. Okay, so here's the question, and the next screen is again the QR code. Scan it or go back to the link that you used if you used the link before, and I will give you a little time to think about it and vote. What is the answer you think is the right answer? Okay, so I'm going to count back from 5, and then I'm going to present you with results of your vote. So a little more time to make a choice. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. And here is the can you guys see the results? Martin, yes, okay. So the results is as following: 5% voted for more than 50%, 3% voted for 50 to 30, 12% for 30 to 10, 41% between 10 and 1, and 39% said fewer than 1%. So I may have already biased you a little bit with what I said before I gave you a chance to vote, because a lot of you gave the right answer, and here it is. The right answer, based on research of representative surveys of a number of different radical communities, including jihadis and also alt-right and also QAnon followers and also incels, it shows that the baseline of radical behavior from radical opinion is fewer than 1%. So out of everybody who believes the most extreme version of whatever ideology we're talking about, fewer than 1% will ever do anything about it. In other words, we give people too much credit, you know, when they say they're going to do something, when we believe them. Most of them will never, ever engage in any action to support their beliefs. And so, as you can see, it is really important to know this if we want to maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of our intervention, of our policing efforts and surveillance efforts, because we can actually do more harm than good when we ignore things like the base rate of action out of an ideologically radical community. When we start targeting people for surveillance and law enforcement efforts based on their ideology, we will produce new grievances in this community and probably radicalize people who otherwise wouldn't have thought twice about their political opinion. And so, what is the role of behavioral insights and the BI Hub in particular? One is to help correct faulty assumptions that are really easy to make. And in fact, our very field had made those same faulty assumptions early on, and we're only able to correct them because we have accumulated a body of data, which we're here to share with you. To collect better data on causes and correlates of violent extremism, to help better identify and prevent radicalization and terrorism. And in particular, the BI Hub, where I have the pleasure of working, hosts a collection of experts, tools, and databases to aid in applying behavioral insights in countering and preventing violent extremism efforts. So that's the end. I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moskalenko, for also very thought-provocative, presentation, and very powerful in terms of, demonstrating the challenges that we're all facing in terms of designing of our programs, making sure that we take into account reliable data, and especially in terms of allocating of our resources and efforts. Thanks so much. Well, I think we have only 7 minutes left. I'm not sure if the link is going to be active after 7 p.m. of my time in Doha, but I'm opening a floor for all the questions. And first of all, if anyone wants to ask a question in person, please use the raise hand function. Otherwise, there are questions in the chat. Well, it looks like nobody wants to ask in person, so let's look at the chat.
Yeah, INNOVATE, there are actually two hands up. Raja Gundu has his hand up, and also there's another colleague. Raja, you want to go first? And then I see a second hand up. We have to unmute him. That's allowed to talk. I'm giving him the floor now. Try this. Raja, you have to unmute yourself. I give you the floor.
Thank
here.
you. Can you hear me?
There
Yes.
you go. Yep. Loud and clear.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very interesting insights. My question is about, what does behavioral science say about the actions of an individual in terms of, when he's part of a mob, as opposed to, when she's acting alone. I mean, we are looking at being part of what I'd say is, overt violence, when you're acting as part of a mob, versus covert violence when you're, perhaps acting as part of an underground, terrorist organization. And whether is it possible to distinguish the possibility of an individual being part of, either through behavioral science, which would basically help us, in fact, to see whether we're looking at an issue, a challenge of violent extremism itself, or we're looking at violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Thank you.
Also take the second hand, so we do give our speakers a minute to think about an answer. I'm gonna give you the floor.
Hi everyone, thank you for the session. I'm Ananya. My question is actually in a continuation with what I asked in the Q&A section. It's mainly about what do we do in a time-sensitive scenario, like how do we undertake a more behavioral scientific approach and a rigorous approach in addressing something which is very time-sensitive, like a warfare or something like that.
Thanks so much. And I'm adding one more question from the chat for Josh and Sophia, so you can pick and choose. There has been a question about why human rights are so rarely raised in the context of behavioral science, and what your thoughts on that. So over to you. Sophia, you want to start? Want to pick any of those questions? And then there are some more questions in the chat. Please keep them coming. We have a few more minutes left. Over to you, Sophia.
So I hope I understood the first question correctly. It sounded to me as though the person was asking whether we could actually locate these individuals within the movements who are dangerous. And I'll give you one of the mantras of the terrorism research field, and that is that there is no profile of a terrorist. We've really, really hoped for one, but after everything that we've learned and as hard as we tried, it is impossible to profile a terrorist, especially a group-based terrorist. There's a little bit of a better chance of finding a so-called lone wolf terrorist. And I have a number of papers on there are two profiles that we developed based on case studies. But the short answer is it is impossible to identify because the pathways that bring people to terrorist groups or terrorist actions are so diverse. It's not like there is a personality type that if we just give a person, a personality questionnaire, we can say, oh, this person is very likely to become a terrorist. And it's not like there's a set of life circumstances that if we just, identify those, okay, the person got kicked out of school, broke up with a girlfriend, like A, B, C, D, we can say, okay, this person is very likely to become terrorist. The chances are identical personalities and identical life circumstances will result in very different outcomes depending on a whole lot of other things. The best we can do is to identify these different pathways and to direct our prevention efforts toward ameliorating conditions that are conducive to anybody becoming radicalized. And as far as human rights, I'm sorry, I kind of missed a second question. As far as second rights, I think it's a critically important issue. Early counterterrorism efforts in the United States after 9/11 were decidedly not informed by human rights. In a lot of ways, they were a knee-jerk reaction, a radicalization on our part, which is a normal process when somebody is attacked, is to become, switch the counterattack mode on. And we're still harvesting the unfortunate fruits of that misguided approach. And so I think this is a very, very important point, because it is counterproductive to not take into account the negative consequences of our actions as CV, PV practitioners and researchers and law enforcement officials.
I would just add on the second question, the RCT question, or the measurement question, really, that I don't think we should get too hung up on RCTs. Obviously, the behavioral world, well, the behavioral science world, applied behavioral science world, sort of grew up with this idea of randomizing treatment and control in order to be able to very cleanly and precisely determine causal effects. But unfortunately, we don't work in a very clean and precise world here. And peace and security issues, it's worth remembering that behavioral science really grew up with issues around financial inclusion and education and things and health and things like that, where it generally is a little bit easier to randomize. Here we are dealing with a very difficult set of constraints in the field. That said, I do think that there are things one can do. I don't know about time-sensitive things. Obviously, the less time you have, the harder it's going to be to evaluate anything. But I do generally find myself advising organizations and governments to start early. If there's an election planned, then you shouldn't leave things to the last, if you're doing advertising campaigns or something like that, do not design those materials in the last month. You can design them 6 months before or even 4 months before and still have plenty of time to evaluate them, let's say in a lab setting, before you roll them out to the field. So the important thing is just to do as much as you can to try to get a rigorous sense of whether something works the way you think it does before you roll it out. Ultimately, it's just about challenging your own assumptions in whatever way that you can.
Thanks, Josh. INNOVATE, I think it's time to wrap up. You want to start?
Yes, thanks so much. Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. I'd like just to take a very quick minute to say that Behavioral Insights Hub is actually mandated to bring the research and practice together. So this session has been not only informative for all of you, but for ourselves as well. I'd like to thank my co-host, Martin, who actually, did a good job keeping all this conversation together. This is the second time we're partnering. I'm looking forward for more dialogues and conversation like this. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Moskalenko and Mr. Martin, for sharing their thoughts and presentations. Again, this is just one of the examples of our very successful collaboration, and I'm looking forward for more joint work done together. And we will take into account all the questions that our participants have shared in the chat. This is all going to be very informative and helpful for shaping up the Hub's work. And my, gratitude goes to organizers of this discussion, United Nations Innovative Network, for having us. And I'm looking forward for more sessions like this during this week. Thanks so much. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks so much, INNOVATE. Always a pleasure to do this together. Colleagues, I posted a link to the website where we will upload the recording to. Give us a few days to clean up the recording and it will be online. And please also check out the UN Innovation Network website. There are a lot of resources that Josh and Sophia mentioned available on that site. If you haven't checked out the program for this week, there are many other exciting sessions in the UN Behavioral Science Week happening. And what I learned a lot, as always, from Sophia and Josh. I really learned today again that we don't know enough. That's what Josh said, and especially when it comes to tipping points and to how people operate. And what I took from Sophia was the point on, the fact that we tend to fall for stories, like the cognitive shortcuts that kick in basically, under pressure, and the very diligent way of how we have come to a point where we can unpack that behavior, right? And Sophia spoke about data and all those new discoveries. So I think this is a call to us to stay on top of things and read up in the scientific literature on what has been discovered, and then indeed apply that practically to our work. Colleagues, thanks so much for joining. Have a wonderful day, and we see you all soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.